Right, this is a lesson on the very last part of social influence, where we look at social change and the role of the various different processes that are happening in that. Social change is where society makes a shift in their beliefs and their actions, and that can be in many different ways. We'll look at a number of examples during this video, but you can probably think of some already where attitudes towards something have changed over time within society. And normally this is as a result, or started off by a minority campaigning, and then gradually the campaign grows and more people get involved until eventually it becomes the norm. That attitude that was originally held by the minority, they've caused enough people to agree with them that it becomes then a process of conformity, that more people agree with it than don't. So let's look at how that happens in more detail and some examples. So as we have a quick look at these, we'll just have a quick look at a few examples, but there's loads I'm sure that you can think of. You can think about how might these changes have happened. And one of the things that I'd like you to do as part of this topic is have a look at some examples and really try and apply some of these processes to them. So this is one that you might be less familiar with, police checks on people working with children. That came into law in March 2002, but it was started off originally by a campaigning group from parents who had been involved in a very distressing case where some children had been kidnapped and murdered by a caretaker at that school who hadn't been police checked. So that was an example of social change that's now come into law. Here's another one, smoking. When I was young, smoking used to happen everywhere, pubs, bars, inside buildings, in workplaces and so on, whereas now it's illegal to smoke inside a building or in lots of different places. And the smoking ban that came in 2007 was a big deal, where you weren't allowed to smoke in pubs anymore and various things like that. And again, that was as a result of campaigning that happened, firstly from a minority until enough people joined in agreeing with it. The plastic bag ban, this is one that happened actually only in the last couple of years, and you're probably much more aware of this one, but there have been people campaigning for years and years and years about this, that we shouldn't be using single-use plastic bags, but it's only recently that the awareness of the effect of plastic on the ocean has become a lot bigger, and so it was only recently that it gained enough momentum and was then put into law. And there are various places like New York that have completely banned plastic bags, I believe Thailand as well. They're sort of partially banned here, and maybe further banned in the future. Here's another example. This is Greta Thunberg, for anyone that doesn't know her. She started off all by herself campaigning in Sweden for the climate. This is one of her first weeks, I think, where she was campaigning for the climate, and that's led to mass protests on Fridays all around the world. Obviously not right now with the coronavirus lockdown, but before this point there were absolutely millions of young people all campaigning along with her. And that's raised massive awareness of the climate. So let's look at what happens when you have examples like these, going from one person or a few people to being something that's accepted and obeyed by millions of people. So here's a quick summary of the different processes that are involved. First of all, someone draws attention to the problem. Secondly, they're persuasive about it. Thirdly, they're consistent about the message. I'm going to go through each of these in a bit more detail in a second. I just want to give you an overview first. Fourthly, they show commitment. You'll be familiar with the idea of that already from when we looked at minority influence. Fifthly, they're flexible in terms of their arguments. Again, you're familiar with that idea. So there's a number of things here that we already know about. And what happens after that point, then you get what's called a snowball effect. effect, where enough people have been converted that it kind of grows and grows and grows like a snowball rolling down a hill. Social cryptoamnesia, I'll talk about that in a minute. And then finally it comes to a point of being conformity and obedience. So that's our overall list of what happens in social change. Let's look at each of those in detail. So first of all, the first thing that needs to happen is drawing attention to the problem. And that's what Greta Thunberg was doing with her sign outside Swedish Parliament, doing a school strike on a Friday. Equally, it's where you have campaigns and public rallies. Some of the teacher strikes more recently again are trying to draw attention to a problem of funding, various things like this. So where you have, I'm sure you can think of a number of cases yourself where you've got people campaigning to try and draw attention to a problem of some sort. And then it's really important to be persuasive, because what that causes people to do is to think a bit more deeply about the issue. If they were kind of okay with this thing before, that they'd accepted the status quo, they kind of think again, actually, oh, these people are being really persuasive, I kind of agree with what they're saying, that is a problem. And so for people to accept the point of view, it has to be persuasive, doesn't it? Because they're when it's minority influence that's happening, they're not going to join that argument or that point of view unless they really agree with it. They have to believe and internalize it. So we're not talking about compliance here again, we're talking about needing people to internalize the argument. Again, consistency, they need to be consistent within the members of the minority group and saying the same thing over time. So if you think about a group like the suffragettes, you had to have all members are giving the same message, and equally over a long time all the campaigners need to keep to that same message. Then you have the augmentation principle is just another way really of saying commitment, which we're all already familiar with. The idea that you need to engage in risky behaviour of some sort that's going to be a personal sacrifice or personal cost. And that really makes people take notice. If people are willing to do stuff, like with the suffragettes, here is an example of force feeding, or where you have martyrs to a religion, where, for example, early Christians being fed to the lions. All of those sorts of behaviours show that the thing that they're trying to draw attention to is really, really important, that they're still campaigning despite massive personal risk. Flexibility then, again, as we've discussed in minority influence, being able to adapt to the arguments of the other side, perhaps taking more minor points on board whilst still keeping going with the thrust of your argument. Then we have the snowball effect. So you get to this point, you have a small campaigning group, a few people join, a few more people join, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, like a snowball rolling down the hill, until you get to the point then of conformity. Once you have enough people have joined the group, it gains more and more momentum, then they become the majority, and then the social influence process of conformity starts to happen, whereby you've got a majority group, and those who haven't yet come on board now start to conform in terms of normative social influence, where they're just trying to be liked, they don't want to be the only person that thinks something different. Social cryptoamnesia is another process, and this is the idea that when we're campaigning for something, or when we're looking at something that people are campaigning about, over time people forget the source of the original, like that small group that started campaigning about it, that might have been quite unpopular. So for example, the early gay pride marches, I've put a picture of here, people that's quite different, isn't it, to our image that we think of in terms of gay pride now, which is a lot different. And a number of people might not want to be associated or agree with this original group. They might think that they're quite weird, or just, not want to be associated with people like that. But over time, as the campaigning grows, we forget about that original group, and so we're not put on, put off agreeing with them because of that original group. We forget what the source of the original idea was, and that's what we mean by social cryptoamnesia, where you've got something that people have been campaigning for. Equally, we could think about the suffragettes. People might not want to be associated with radical suffragettes, but then as time goes on and you get far enough away from the suffragettes, people might be like, okay, yeah, the idea of women having the vote, and we're okay with this, and they've forgotten about the kind of radical weirdos that started it off. I'm not saying that suffragettes were weird, I'm just trying to get the point across. Okay, so conformity and obedience then play a part. I've mentioned them already, but it's worth just saying again how they fit in. So we can, how this works in practice is, if we're trying to get people to change their attitudes and opinions, we can encourage more people to conform by spreading information about those that are already doing it. We can also, eventually, obedience happens because you have a law that is passed in many cases. So, for example, a law allowing gay marriage, or the law for the smoking ban, and I mentioned a number, didn't I, earlier? So you, in terms of obedience, if you're trying to get people to conform to a social change, you might want, and you want to use the power of obedience, you might want to get them to first of all encourage people to obey smaller things and then build up. So, for example, the plastic bag ban started in a smaller way, and then the price was raised and so on. So that's the idea of gradual commitment, which links back again to Milgram's experiment, where he had the 15 volts more each time. You start with something small and build it up. Right. Let's look at, so that was the different social change processes, social influence processes involved in social change, and you need to be able to remember as many of those as possible. If you're asked to apply this to an example, don't just remember your 3 ones: commitment, consistency and flexibility that you already know. Try and make sure you know some more as well, and how they fit in. And people often forget to think about conformity and obedience, so make sure you understand how they're involved as well. Quick look at psychology and the economy and how that links with this. If we're able to change people's behaviour, that has various ways that it can benefit the economy. One obvious way is through things like getting people to eat more healthily, which saves the NHS money. But there are lots of different ways, and there are various ways probably in which they could bring this into the exam in terms of psychology and the economy. So it's worth just being aware that that's the link. If we're changing people's behaviour, how is it going to benefit the economy? Possibly by saving money for NHS, or getting more taxes or something like that. So just be aware that this could crop up with this topic. Let's look at some evaluation briefly. One weakness of this theory is that the social influence processes, they're kind of like a list of blanket processes that happen in lots of cases, aren't they? But they don't take various things into account, such as how similar the minority and majority are. So if you've got a minority and majority that are really different from each other, then they're much less likely to be able to win the majority over. And so because of that, it's an incomplete theory. It's not taking other cognitive factors into account. So this is a strength. There's research support that supports all the different processes, and well, I mean, not quite research, but examples from the past. I'm so used to saying research support. Yeah, historic examples are supporting all the different processes, and in your booklet there's many of these outlined, suffragettes and so on. So make sure you've had a good look at that. Research also shows that conformity processes are important. So again, you'll find there's a study outlined in your booklet that explains how conformity processes were used, and an example where they were trying to get residents of a block of flats to do something. If they told them that everyone else was also doing it, then they were far more likely to change their behaviour. So we've got research really supporting the idea that conformity can make a difference in social change. And then the last evaluation point that I'm going to outline for you is just that minority influence is really limited. It's really hard to say that the social change has occurred as a result of the minority influence. So, for example, the suffragettes did loads of campaigning, didn't they? But then there was like a break in the campaigning while World War II happened, and then it was only after World War II that the vote was given, and you could argue really that the change in attitudes was more to do with the fact that the women had taken on lots of jobs in the war and stuff like that, and so it perhaps made people look at them differently. So you could argue that it wasn't the suffragettes at all that had caused the change in attitude that allowed that social change to occur. So yeah, that's your fourth evaluation point.